On the morning of October the 20th, 1862, 20,000 people packed the streets around Newgate Prison. They'd been gathering since the night before, huddled in doorways in the driving rain. Those lucky enough to live in buildings overlooking the gallows rented out their windows at a premium. Street vendors worked the crowd selling food, broadsheets, and penny souvenirs. Pickpockets had a field day. They had all come to watch a woman die. That woman was Catherine Wilson. She had been convicted of 1 murder, but she was suspected of at least 7. She killed her lover, her landlady, the aunt of her partner, a young mother, and a retired sea captain. She forged signatures, faked letters, manipulated grieving families, and talked her way out of trouble again and again. So brace yourselves, because here is Catherine Wilson's full story. Part 1: The Girl from the Fens. According to newspaper reports from the time of her trial, she was born around 1817 and baptized Constance Crane, in the tiny village of Surfleet, in Lincolnshire. Her father was a carpenter who ended his days in one of the local bead houses, which were essentially hostels for the destitute. What we do know is that her early life was bleak. Lincolnshire in the early 19th century was flat, marshy fenland, a world of drainage ditches and farming communities where poverty was the rule, not the exception. For a girl born into nothing, her options were grim. It was mostly a choice between domestic service, factory work, prostitution, or the workhouse. Catherine chose domestic service, but that didn't go well. According to reports, she was in trouble from a young age. At 14, she committed what the papers delicately called a notorious robbery. She'd gone to the house of a family friend as a child visitor and stolen from them while she was there. After confessing, she left home, struck out on her own, and went to live in Spalding, where she reportedly led what Victorian moralists described as a loose life. But it was also in Spalding that she began working as a nurse. And this is the crucial detail. In the 1850s, nursing wasn't the regulated profession we know today. There were no formal qualifications required, no background checks, and no regulatory bodies. If you said you were a nurse, you were a nurse. And if you worked in private homes, caring for the sick and elderly, nobody was watching what you did. A few years later, Catherine met and married a respectable mariner, and for a time, her life seemed to improve, but when her husband went to sea, she allegedly returned to her old bad habits, living a loose life. By 1850, both of her parents were dead. In 1853, Catherine had entered the service of a man named Captain Peter Mora, and this is when people around her started dying. Part 2: The Medicine Cabinet. Catherine Wilson didn't use a knife or a gun to kill. She used something far more elegant, far harder to detect, and something she had completely legitimate access to: colchicum. Colchicum is derived from the autumn crocus, Colchicum autumnale, a pretty purple flower that's been known to medicine for over 3,000 years. Even Benjamin Franklin, who suffered terribly from gout, brought colchicum plants to America to treat his condition. The active ingredient, colchicine, works by interfering with cell division. In small, carefully measured doses, it reduces inflammation brilliantly. The Reverend Sidney Smith wrote in 1838 that on Sunday he was on crutches, completely unable to put foot on the ground, and by Tuesday he'd walked several miles. That was the power of colchicum. But in larger doses, it's a nightmare. The symptoms begin 2 to 5 hours after ingestion: a burning sensation in the mouth and throat, then fever, violent vomiting, severe abdominal pain, followed by kidney failure. Death can take several days, and here's the thing that made it perfect for a killer in the 1850s: the symptoms of colchicine poisoning look almost identical to cholera, and cholera was everywhere in Victorian England. People died of it all the time, so nobody even looked twice. Captain Peter Mora was an elderly retired sea captain living in Lincolnshire. He suffered badly from rheumatism and gout, and had been prescribed colchicum by his doctor. Catherine Wilson became his housekeeper, and by all accounts, she was brilliant at the job. She was attentive, caring, and indispensable. So indispensable that within months, the grateful old captain made his will, naming Catherine as his sole beneficiary. Not long after that, Captain Mora fell terribly ill. After about 2 weeks of agony, he died in October 1854. The doctor who'd been treating him wasn't particularly surprised. He concluded that Mora had simply been in so much pain from his gout that he'd accidentally taken too large a dose of his own medicine. The verdict was accidental death, and no post-mortem was carried out. Catherine, weeping what one account wonderfully described as tears worthy of any crocodile, collected the inheritance and headed for pastures new. She headed south, to London. Part 3: The London Years. In London, Catherine entered the high-spending, heavy drinking social circuit, and in one of the clubs she frequented, she met a younger man named James Dixon. They became lovers and moved in together in Bedford Square, just off Tottenham Court Road. They introduced themselves to their new landlady, a 50-year-old widow named Maria Soames, as Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. James Dixon was by several accounts a heavy drinker, and Catherine soon grew tired of him. In early 1856, Dixon suddenly fell violently ill. A doctor was called, who diagnosed rheumatic fever. Catherine helpfully mentioned that she'd been treating him with colchicum. 2 days after the doctor's visit, Dixon was dead. The doctor wanted to perform a post-mortem, and it's here we see Catherine Wilson's genius, because she didn't panic or run, she wept, she pleaded, she told the doctor that James had always had a terrible horror of being cut up after death. She begged him not to mutilate her beloved husband's body, and the doctor, presumably moved by this display of wifely devotion, backed down. Dixon was buried in a hurry, with no post-mortem and no awkward questions asked. Catherine then wrote to Dixon's uncle, a Mr. Atkinson living in Kirkby, telling him that James had died of consumption, tuberculosis, a perfectly ordinary cause of death. The Atkinsons had no reason to doubt her, so they stayed in touch. Now here's where it gets really cold. Catherine was still living with Mrs. Soames, the landlady, and they had become close friends. Maria Soames was recently widowed and owned several properties. She was comfortable, trusting, and increasingly reliant on Catherine's company and care. In the late summer of 1856, while Soames was away on holiday, her house was reportedly burgled. Silver was stolen, along with some of Catherine's possessions. Whether this burglary was genuine or staged by Catherine herself is unknown, but it had the effect of making Maria Soames feel protective towards her friend and lodger. Then, on the morning of October 16, 1856, Maria Soames complained of feeling unwell. Catherine naturally stepped in as her nurse. The previously healthy Maria Soames was dead within 2 days. The doctor attended but saw nothing suspicious, so again, no post-mortem was carried out. Then Catherine brazenly forged an IOU and presented it to the Soames family, extracting money from the estate. She also tried to claim that Soames had committed suicide by poison after being deceived by a man who had made her a false promise of marriage, and a letter was produced. That letter was later found to be in Catherine's handwriting. 2 victims in the space of a few months, both dead of natural causes and both with Catherine Wilson at their bedside, mixing their medicine, mopping their brow, and watching them die. Part 4, the killing continues. After Soames' death, Catherine Wilson moved on again. Catherine had an old friend, a Mrs. Jane Jackson, who lived back in Boston, Lincolnshire. Jackson was a young mother whose husband, a millwright named David, was often away for work. Catherine visited her, and in 1859, Mrs. Jackson suddenly became violently ill after eating. She died 4 days later. After her death, relatives discovered that Jackson's money was missing. Eventually, it emerged that Catherine had produced a promissory note, signed by 2 people from Boston, for the exact amount of money that was gone. The signatures turned out to be forgeries. Catherine had also apparently withdrawn nearly £200 from Mr. Jackson's bank account using his wife's name. Then there was a man named Taylor. Catherine was nursing him, and like her previous patients, he began suffering violent retching, vomiting, and purging. But Taylor was luckier than the others. He took some remedies that worked, and he survived. If he suspected Wilson, he apparently didn't act on it. And then came Mrs. Atkinson. And Atkinson was a well-respected milliner from Kirkby. She was, in fact, the aunt of the dead James Dixon. She was a successful businesswoman who employed several apprentices, and every year she made a trip to London to buy stock for her shop. In October 1860, and made her annual trip to London. She stayed, as she had before, with Catherine Wilson, whom she knew as a Mrs. Taylor. She brought with her a considerable sum of money for her business purchases. Within days, Joseph Atkinson, and's husband, received a letter from his wife, followed the next morning by a telegram from Mrs. Taylor. He rushed to London. When he arrived, he found and suffering from violent sickness and purging. Another nephew, Leonard Dixon Lund, also came to visit. He was holding his aunt in his arms when she died. Before she died, Atkinson complained about the food Catherine had been preparing for her. Her exact words, recorded in the court documents, were, "I never tasted such hogwash stuff in my life." After Anne died, Catherine convinced the grieving Mr. Atkinson that it had been his wife's wish not to be opened up after death, so no post-mortem was performed. Anne's considerable sum of money had, of course, vanished. Catherine later wrote several times to Joseph Atkinson asking him to lend her money, with various sob stories about being robbed. A man named Thomas Taylor wrote to Atkinson calling Catherine that most infamous woman and declaring her stories to be lies. Taylor himself had lived with Catherine at times, despite having a wife and children elsewhere, and was most likely the man she tried and failed to poison. When Atkinson's body was eventually exhumed in 1861, traces of arsenic were found, so Catherine wasn't even limiting herself to colchicum now, she was using whatever was to hand. Part 5. The Mistake. For nearly a decade, Catherine Wilson had operated with impunity. She'd killed at least 4 people, probably more. She'd forged documents, stolen money, manipulated grieving families, and talked her way out of every close call. She must have felt untouchable. And maybe that's what made her sloppy. By 1862, Catherine was working as a live-in nurse for a Mrs. Sarah Carnell. Sarah was separated from her husband, lonely, and therefore exactly the kind of vulnerable person Catherine targeted. True to form, Catherine gained Sarah's trust and affection. Sarah was soon rewriting her will in Catherine's favor. And then Catherine did something inexplicable. Instead of using her usual method, the slow, gradual administration of colchicum, mimicking a natural illness, she gave Sarah Carnell a soothing draught laced with sulfuric acid. Now, colchicum is subtle. Its symptoms build over hours and look like any number of natural illnesses. Sulfuric acid is not subtle. Sulfuric acid burns through everything it touches, on contact. Catherine handed the glass to Sarah with the words, "Drink it down, love, it will warm you." Sarah took a mouthful. It burned her mouth instantly, she screamed and spat it out. The liquid landed on the bedclothes and burned holes straight through them. Some hit the carpet and burned through that too. The glass was later found to contain enough sulfuric acid to kill 50 people. Sarah called her husband and Catherine Wilson quite sensibly did a runner. Sarah Carnell contacted the chemist who'd prepared the original prescription. He confirmed that no mistake had been made on his side. Then Sarah went to the police. Catherine was arrested about 6 weeks later and charged with attempted murder. Part 6. The Trials. What happened next is one of those moments in legal history that makes you want to throw something at the wall. Catherine's defense was simple. The boy in the chemist's shop had given her sulfuric acid by mistake. She had no idea what was in the bottle. It was all a terrible accident. The judge, Lord Bramwell, didn't buy it for a second. He pointed out to the jury that if the bottle had actually contained sulfuric acid when Catherine received it from the chemist, it would have become red hot or burst before she even got it home. The defense's theory was physically impossible. The jury acquitted her anyway. There is, as her own lawyer later wrote, no accounting for juries. To the astonishment of almost everyone in the courtroom, Catherine Wilson walked free. But not for long. As she left the dock, she was immediately rearrested. Because while she'd been in custody, something remarkable had happened. The coverage of the Carnell case had prompted people to come forward. Captain Mora's relatives, the Soames family, the Atkinsons, and the Jacksons. One by one, the suspicious deaths had surfaced. The police had launched a full investigation and bodies had been exhumed, and there was now enough evidence to charge Catherine Wilson with murder. She was charged with 7 murders in total but tried for just one, the killing of Maria Soames, back in 1856. The prosecution chose this case because it was the strongest. The trial began on the 25th of September, 1862, at the Old Bailey, before Mr. Justice Byles. Catherine pleaded not guilty and was defended by Montague Williams, a barrister who would later become quite famous. The prosecution star witness was Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, one of the most respected toxicologists in England and widely regarded as the father of British forensic medicine. Taylor testified that the symptoms Maria Soames had suffered before her death were entirely consistent with colchicine poisoning. The defense argued that after 6 years, no reliable traces of the poison could be detected in the exhumed remains. This was technically true, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming: the pattern of befriending victims, the rewritten wills, the sudden illnesses, the absence of post-mortems, and Catherine's presence at every single deathbed. Justice Byles, summing up for the jury, delivered one of the most chilling lines in British legal history. He said, "Gentlemen, if such a state of things as this were allowed to exist, no living person could sit down to a meal in safety." The jury found her guilty. Catherine Wilson showed no emotion as the judge placed the black cap on his head and sentenced her to death. Part 7. The Condemned Cell. Catherine Wilson was returned to Newgate Prison and lodged in the condemned cell. She had less than a month to live. She petitioned the Home Secretary for mercy, insisting that all the people she had allegedly poisoned had died of natural causes. She maintained that there was no proof she had ever possessed any poison, and no satisfactory proof that anyone had died by poison at all. The petition was denied. While she was in prison, Peter Mora's brother, John, wrote asking to visit. He wanted to know the truth about his brother's death. Catherine wrote back from Newgate. It read in part, "I received your letter this morning. I must decline your visit, with thanks. You say you sincerely forgive the past. You never had anything to forgive me of. I always treated you well. I never had any malice towards you, and now I have none towards those that has falsely swore my life away, for I most solemnly declared I am innocent of those dreadful charges." She added, at the same time, how much better to die innocent than guilty. On the Sunday before her execution, she attended chapel services twice. That night, despite storms and heavy rain hammering the prison walls, she reportedly slept well. Part 8. The Scaffold. 8 o'clock, Monday morning, the 20th of October, 1862. It had been 14 years since a woman had been executed in Middlesex. The last was Harriet Parker in 1848. So the prospect of a female hanging drew a crowd of an estimated 20,000 people. Many had been there all night, enduring the rain. When it stopped around midnight, they poured out of their shelters and took up positions. The man tasked with carrying out the sentence was William Calcraft, England's official hangman. Calcraft was 62 years old and had been in the job since 1829. He was, by this point, something of a national figure. He'd started his career selling meat pies outside Newgate Prison and had fallen into the hangman business almost by accident, befriending the previous executioner. Over his 45-year career, he would carry out an estimated 450 executions, including those of 34 women. Calcraft was also notorious for using the short drop method, where the fall through the trapdoor was only about 3 feet. This was frequently insufficient to break the neck, meaning the condemned person died by slow strangulation, which could take several agonizing minutes. On occasion, Calcraft was known to go below the scaffold and pull on the prisoner's legs to speed things up, or even climb on their shoulders. On this occasion, however, the records suggest it was mercifully quick. Catherine Wilson walked firmly to the scaffold. She ignored the jeers and catcalls of the crowd. Calcraft placed the white hood over her head and tightened the noose. The trapdoor fell. She reportedly died without a struggle, with what the newspapers described as great composure. She was the last woman to be publicly hanged in London. 6 years later, public executions in England would be abolished entirely.